But the road to Pokrovsk, that now seems to be the main focus of whether the Russians are about to make a breakthrough and whether the Ukrainians can hold them. The fact that the Ukrainians are putting all this video out seems to indicate that they think they are holding them and producing huge losses, but that also may be propaganda undertaken when things are not going well for Kyiv.
Specifically on that push towards Pokrovsk, Ukraine's 97th Air Assault Brigade, they've uploaded a video on social media which they claim to show smashing this advance. They say they've struck 6 tanks, 7 armoured personnel carriers, and 40 people are being killed. I mean, what can you tell us about the veracity of that?
Yeah, so the 79th Air Assault Brigade, they've issued a lot of stuff on video, and it is very convincing in the sense that, yes, I don't think it's made up. These armoured vehicles are being hit. What we can't be sure about is exactly where this is taking place unless it's geolocated, and that it can be geolocated, but I haven't seen that so far. But undoubtedly, they are scoring some quite big hits, which shows that the Ukrainians are getting more ammunition now. I mean, the Ukrainians have always said, we can make life much, much harder for the Russians if we weren't running out of ammunition. So that's clearly the case. The other thing, though, that's interesting about this is that the Russians, where they've been making progress all along the front, have been doing it because they are dismounting. They're getting out of their vehicles and they're making it in small detachments of troops, and they're throwing their troops forward with no regard to how many of them get killed, and lots of them do. So they're using their foreign mobilized troops and the convicts that they've got, their cheap troops, and they're throwing them forward to locate the firing positions of the Ukrainians, and then they're hitting the Ukrainians with artillery from those firing positions. So they're sacrificing the lives deliberately of their forward troops, and then they're making progress by dismounting, by moving forward in small detachments. They only go back in their vehicles because they know they are vulnerable in their vehicles to modern warfare, but they only go back in their armoured vehicles when they think they are making the breakthrough. So the fact that the 79th have taken out so many armoured vehicles, a big armoured thrust on the road to Pokrovsk, tells me that the Russians think that they are making a big breakthrough. They wouldn't get back into their vehicles unless they thought they could push right through now. Now, whether they can or not, we don't know, but that's something that we'll be keeping our eye on in the next few days. We're not now so concerned about Chasiv Yar, which was in the crosshairs a couple of weeks ago, still vulnerable, but Chasiv Yar looks to be more stable. But the road to Pokrovsk, that now seems to be the main focus of whether the Russians are about to make a breakthrough and whether the Ukrainians can hold them. The fact that the Ukrainians are putting all this video out seems to indicate that they think they are holding them and producing huge losses, but that also may be propaganda undertaken when things are not going well for Kyiv.
Obviously, intense fighting for any gains made by Russia, but in an article by The Economist recently, it questions how long they can continue to keep this up because they're increasingly having to raid stores in the Soviet area of tanks and armoured infantry fighting vehicles and artillery to keep going. How do you see it?
Yeah, the Russians have brought enough onto the battlefield to create this push. Remember, this push has been going on since about March, where they've tried to increase the pressure everywhere all at once, all the way around that big semicircle of front, from Kharkiv in the north right round to the south towards Orikhiv, where the Ukrainians have tried to push through in the summer. So it's like a big semicircle. And the Russians have tried to push all the way around that circle. So they tried at Kharkiv, they've tried at Kupiansk, they're now trying at Pokrovsk. Before that, they've been pushing at Chasiv Yar and Novovelosilka, all of those areas. They can't keep that up forever, and they will probably start to run out of steam. This is what The Economist was saying toward the end of the year when the weather starts to turn, which it will do in September, October. I mean, the weather is pretty predictable in Ukraine because it's part of the Russian steppes. You know it's going to be very hot in the summer. You know it'll be very cold in the winter. You know pretty well when the rains will start and when the ground will get wet. So within a week either way, that's pretty predictable. So the Russians know that they will run out of time, and they're pushing as hard as they can before they begin to run out of time for this offensive to make some real progress. And next year, the Russians will struggle. They've increased their war production, of course. They've got more stuff coming in from North Korea and Iran, and they may get more of that. They may get more from China, and there's a big political issue there. But in terms of their own production, they plateau sometime in 2025 in terms of the increases that they've made this year. So the Russians are certainly not invincible, and the Ukrainians figure that if they can hold them this summer and autumn, then things, depending on what happens in the rest of the world, things may start to get better for the Ukrainians in the spring of next year. And so I think both sides, in a sense, are playing up to the autumn. They're playing for the rest of this fighting season, and both sides, one is trying to make a breakthrough, one is trying to hold on. Both sides understand that spring 2025 will be the moment for some decision on the battlefield that we haven't seen for the last 18 months.
And apart from the weather, and you talk about what about the US election? I mean, how do you think the prospect of a new president is actually determining the short and the long-term strategies for both the Russians and the Ukrainians? Because you mentioned Russia trying to get as much as the Donbass as possible. How is that playing into their strategy?
Yeah, I think it's having a big effect, Kate. I mean, obviously, if Trump is elected, then things would start to change immediately, because if he's elected on the 5th of November, he doesn't become president until the second week of January. But the knowledge that he is going to become president would start to create lots of changes in NATO, in the attitude of East European governments, and in the Ukrainian attitude and the Russian attitude. So, before he lifts a finger, the idea that he will create the circumstances in which the Ukrainians will be forced into negotiating on very bad terms, that expectation will begin to work its way through. In the longer run, that scenario, in a sense, is facing the Ukrainians anyway, but maybe not under such extreme circumstances. So, in other words, even if, let's say, Kamala Harris is elected, the Democrats, retain the White House and the Congress remains democratic effectively, then the United States will still not fight for Ukraine, as it were, won't give it tremendous amounts of aid in the years to come, but it will actually help it get into a better negotiating position. So the Ukrainians know that they're probably going to have to try to achieve a much better negotiating position sometime during next year. And in that respect, the key issue is Putin seen to fail in Ukraine? By the middle of next year, will the world perceive that the Russians have basically failed? And does he therefore have to make a deal on that basis? If that's the case, then most people in the West would say that's a pretty good outcome. But if the perception is that he has succeeded, that somehow the aggression has been rewarded and therefore he'll be back for more in a couple of years' time, if that is the perception, then the Ukrainians will be taken to a negotiating position which is completely unacceptable to them. And if they're forced into it, then so be it. But whereas the Trump administration would force them into it quite quickly, the American Democratic administration might edge them towards it over the course of another year or 18 months. And that, of course, will be a very different situation for them.
And as we wait for that election in November, I mean, to what extent do you think the Ukrainian strategy is to show that every single inch of ground that the Russian forces might take, they have to pay a very high price in terms of manpower?
Yeah, well, that is the case at the moment. I mean, even the conservative estimates of our own Ministry of Defence are that the Russian losses are now at 550,000. The new chief of the General Staff only this week, and the head of the British Army, said that they'll be looking at 1 million to 1.5 million in about a year's time at current rates of loss. I mean, it is confirmed that the Russians are losing 1,200 men a day, every day. That's loss in terms of death and serious injury. So they've got to be taken away from the battle zone itself. They can't continue to function because they're so badly injured or they're lying dead on the battlefield. So 1,200 a day. And although the vast majority of these Russian casualties are not boys from Moscow and Petersburg, they're from the east, from Buryatia and Siberia. They're foreigners, they're convicts. They're the troops that Russia doesn't care about. But nevertheless, as losses get towards the 1 million mark, which they will on present trends by the end of the year, that has to have some effect. However indifferent Putin personally is to all of this, and he does seem to be indifferent, but that will have some effect on Russian society, which is now full of disquiet about all of this. So the Ukrainians are making the Russians pay, although it's very painful for them themselves. They are making them pay for every inch of ground, and they want to prove that they can continue to do that. But for Ukraine, the problem is that they've also got to show that they can actually retake ground. They've got to show that they can get back on the offensive. Otherwise, the Western world is going to say, well, look, if you can't retake ground, however slowly you're losing it, you ought to negotiate before you lose even more. So the Ukrainians have got to show they can take back significant areas in order to go into some sort of negotiation in next year or even the year after on much more favorable terms, which is what they'll be trying to do.